And today, during our closing session, we will discuss how storytelling impacts health and healing for patients, caregivers, and communities of color. And we'll learn how to bear witness to powerful stories of racism and health literacy to help us collectively change the narrative. This Racism and Health Literacy Symposium is part of SAA's call for a racially just healthcare system and an end to the discriminatory health literacy and health communication practices that often leave patients and caregivers of color unseen, unheard, and unhealed. Just a few guidelines as we hold this space. First and foremost, please be kind. Keep an open mind. Stay on mute. Speak out in the chat box. You can also share your thoughts on social media with the hashtag RHL23. We'll also drop a PDF of the event program into the chat. It should be there already. Or you can find it at our website, www.saa.org. Okay. This is our agenda for today's session. First, bearing witness. We'll start with introductions, then discuss storytelling's impacts on health and healing. We'll reflect back on the power of story to change how we care and bear witness to a powerful story of racism and health literacy. Finally, we'll wrap up with a question and answer session before we close. If you have questions, please use the question answer function on Zoom. And finally, when the session is over, we ask that you contribute to the learning by filling out a brief evaluation of the event, and that you share in the evaluations any reflections you have on the program. And now, just a few words about me. My name is Dr. Valerie Williams Sanchez. I'm Vice President of Multicultural Intelligence and Relevance for a full-service brand and ad agency based in Chicago called Blue Chip. For more than 25 years, I've worked in marketing and communications. I've earned degrees from UC Berkeley, Columbia, and St. John's here in New York. My PhD is in literacy, and my theoretical grounding is in culturally relevant pedagogy. My literacy content areas of interest are education and reading, culture, and health. I'm a passionate advocate for the elimination of health disparities among diverse communities through my health literacy activities and activism. And I'm happy to say that it's my friendship with co-founder Anna Allen, with whom I attended journalism school, graduate school, and my work with health literacy that has brought me to SAA, where I've been a proud board member since 2017. SAA is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 2007. It's dedicated to improving the lives of patients, caregivers, and communities by improving health literacy. SAA's impact and influence is grounded in our community work. We have provided in-person workshops to more than 12,500 community members at over 60 host sites in the New York metropolitan area. From Head Start to hospice, from Latinx high school students to LGBTQ plus older adults, from cancer survivors to the newly diagnosed. We have learned a tremendous amount about the people we serve. And these lessons are what inform the education and training we've provided to more than 2,500 frontline professionals in health literacy best practices. These lessons are also embedded in our plain language health literacy materials, which have been translated into 8 languages. And those same learnings are what inform and are what are embedded in our programs, our events like this one that we host to help professionals deepen their ability to understand the patients, clients, and communities that they serve, and to enhance their ability to communicate across health literacy divides. Now, for those who cannot see the picture on this next slide, I'm happy to share that these are photos of SAA's work in the community. The first to the left features a Cantonese language workshop on how to use ER safely and effectively. The second in the center is SEA staff member helping two older adults understand a healthcare proxy document. And the third is a Spanish language health literacy workshop at a community center in New York City. SEA works to help people gain the skills needed to be health literate, or as Janet Ohana Frempong said on Tuesday, to be as well as they can be. Specifically, SEA empowers patients and caregivers with knowledge through our workshops, curricula, and materials. We train frontline health and social service providers in health literacy best practices. This includes plain language, universal design, teachbacks, narrative competency, and narrative humility, which Dr. Sayantani Dasgupta discussed in her keynote speech. We provide plain language and accessible design services, as well as consulting to help ensure materials are accessible to the broadest possible audience, including nearly 1 out of 2 adult Americans who are functionally illiterate in the face of the healthcare system. On top of that, we advocate for policy change to ensure that health information and services are easy to access, understand, and to use by everyone. Today's symposium is held in solidarity with the national observance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. That was earlier this week. For those unable to see the screen, there is a picture here featuring Dr. King and the words he spoke in 1966. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhumane because it often results in physical death. Racism kills. And as we have seen over the course of this symposium, narratives that frame, inform, and feed racism also kill. Here now, with tools and insights to change the narrative, is SEA's narrative competency lead, Jade Dixon. Jade is a graduate of Harvard University, where she received a master's degree, and she received a master's degree from the narrative medicine program at Columbia University. She plans to continue by earning her medical degree. Jade has a passion for serving the underserved and for achieving health equity and social justice in healthcare. And now, Jade Dickinson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Valerie, for that very warm welcome. It's so great to be here with you all today on the final day of the symposium as we prepare to delve into important topics such as changing the narrative, the power of narrative, and the importance of sharing our stories in healthcare. So as it was just stated, I have a background in narrative medicine. Now, some of you may have never heard of that field or term and may be wondering what on earth is narrative medicine. And I will say everyone in the field has their own personal definition of what narrative medicine is, but I'll start by sharing this. Narrative medicine is an interdisciplinary field that brings powerful narrative skills of radical listening and creativity from the humanities and the arts to address the needs of all those who seek and deliver healthcare, so that we may all be heard, recognized, and valued. And in the same vein, narrative medicine seeks to address the many structural inequalities and complex social justice issues that we see in healthcare every day. Next slide, please. So I wanted to open up this presentation today with a quote from the Principles and Practice of Narrative Medicine, which reads, "Within the clinical encounter, the therapeutic value for the patient of being listened to is widely recognized. Less considered is the co-constructed nature of the exchange, how the listener or clinician, as well as the context in which they confer, contributes to, and even shapes what the teller is able to formulate or express. Much of healthcare happens in interpersonal moments, and narrative medicine is attentive to the relational dynamics at work in every human encounter." So essentially what this is saying is there's great power in our stories and in our ability to share them. There's power in being afforded the opportunity within the clinical setting and space to share our stories. Next slide, please. So moving forward with this realization that our stories and our voices harness this immense power, here's a quote from Rita Sharon, the founder of the narrative medicine field and program at Columbia. Patients and their families are giving voice to their suffering, finding ways to write of illness and to articulate and therefore comprehend what they endure in sickness. The therapeutic potential of narrative medicine expands when we encourage patients to join us in writing their own medical charts, for patients are, or should be, the co-authors and curators of whatever records are kept about them. So for whoever has joined us previously for session 1 and 2, this quote really taps into what we talked about regarding power dynamics and narrative humility in session 1. We all have the right and the power to be the authors of our own stories and to share those stories in these spaces that are really designed to care for us. Furthermore, storytelling is one of the oldest art forms in human history, something that really grounds us all together in our humanity. And we've seen how it really can make a difference in the healthcare experience. According to the Creating Healthy Communities, Arts and Public Health in America initiative, the arts can be especially beneficial for public health in 5 key areas, including collective trauma, racism, mental health, social exclusion and isolation, and chronic disease. And as we all know, these are areas that really affect communities of color and marginalized populations. Next slide, please. So we can't talk about the importance or power of our stories without also discussing the silencing of them and how marginalized communities are often rendered invisible in healthcare settings. So of course, I have to bring up Audre Lorde's cancer journals in this conversation because for anyone that's read this, she really highlights many of the themes in her memoir, many of the themes that we're discussing today, and how she felt silenced and invisible during her experience with breast cancer and subsequent recovery. More specifically, I think she does a phenomenal job of highlighting how the intersectionality of her marginalized identities affected her illness experience. She was a Black queer woman, and she shared how she was really overcome during her illness experience with severe feelings of loneliness. She felt that there were no visible figures or women or visible stories that she could relate to. So I'll share a quote that she wrote from the Cancer Journals that said, "Off and on, I kept thinking, I have cancer. I'm a Black, lesbian, feminist poet. How am I going to do this now? Where are the models for what I'm supposed to be in this situation?" But there were none. This is it, Audre. You're on your own. And to move forward with this point, there's even a point in the memoir where she details how a representative from Reach for Recovery came to visit her after her mastectomy to discuss the recovery process and possible reconstruction surgeries and things of that nature. And she wrote that all of their conversations focused on the appearance of prosthetic breasts and how real and appealing they would look to men. But Audre was a lesbian and she loved women, so she grappled with the invisibility of her sexuality during this very vulnerable time in her life. And she felt isolated in breast cancer support groups, as ironic as that sounds. So another very profound quote from Lorde states, "Black women have on one hand always been highly visible, and so on the other hand have been rendered invisible through the depersonalization of racism. Even within the women's movement, we have had to fight, and still do, for that very visibility, which also renders us most vulnerable, our Blackness." Next slide, please. But on the other hand, in the Cancer Journals, we also see how Audre Lorde changed her own narrative, which is something that we're really focusing on today and is a major theme today as we talk about changing the narrative and the power of narratives. And in her memoir, we see how she kind of took her power back. We see her transform her story from one of invisibility and pain, confusion, to one of healing and transformation and inclusion, which she ultimately develops into an embodied pedagogy for freedom and expression of lived truths for herself and other survivors who identify with her, something that she never had as she was going through her own illness experience. So I'll share another quote. This is probably one of the most famous quotes from her memoir. She writes, "My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. But for every real word spoken, for every attempt I had ever made to speak those truths for which I'm still seeking, I had made contact with other women while we examined the words to fit a world in which we all believed bridging our differences. Next slide, please. Once again, I know I've been drilling this idea in, but I just want to emphasize that there really is profound power in bearing witness to all stories and in understanding the ways that it can completely and truly transform community health, literacy, and feelings of belonging for marginalized populations, communities that for centuries have felt and have been made to feel like we don't belong. One of my favorite quotes that I also want to share with you all today says, "Love, like rain, cannot choose the grass on which it falls." And I believe the same holds true in medicine and healthcare. As healthcare workers and community activists and all of us in this field, we can't pick and choose which communities and which stories we care for. You know, love and healthcare are more similar than we like to think. Both require a great deal of compassion, and it's truly our duty to bear witness to all stories, even the vulnerable ones, even the ones we aren't familiar with, even the ones that maybe we were raised in environments and homes and communities where we were taught to not agree with those stories or to look down on those stories or to not resonate with said stories. But it's our duty to bear witness and to understand and to allow the freedom and the space for those stories to be said and to be heard. The first step in properly caring for all communities is hearing and understanding even the most vulnerable stories. It's choosing to challenge stereotypes. It's choosing to look beyond our preconceived notions, our implicit biases, and our single stories. Next slide, please. So I just want to share, we're going to get this video set up for you all, but I just want to share a very short snippet of this amazing TED Talk that discusses what I just said, the danger of a single story, and how it really proves to be dangerous territory in society and can also be very dangerous in healthcare. Can we hear the video? Okay, 1 second, everyone.
Principle of Nkali, how they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but
rewind that to 9:37. Just give us 1 second, everyone, as we get this started from the beginning for you guys.
it is impossible, is what they become.
Can you hear that?
Yes, we can hear that now.
Talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think.
Oops. Sorry.
It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is Nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of Nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. No.
All right, we're going to get the slides pulled back up. So in the talk, she goes on to say, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And she also says, the consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. So in closing out that thought, it is my immense honor and my immense privilege to introduce our closing speaker for this event today, and the amazing storyteller Antoinette Cooper, as she will share her story with us all today. So Antoinette Cooper is a writer, a TEDx speaker, and the founder of the nonprofit Black Exhale, a space for the liberated Black body. She was recently awarded a residency with Black Space as a Black artist and activist, a literary grant from the Cafe Royal Cultural Foundation, and with work published in the Amistad Literary Arts Journal and Intima, a journal of narrative medicine and poetry foundation, she's currently at work publishing a multi-genre collection documenting the historical and present-day violences on the Black female body. As a multidisciplinary artist and educator, she served as a writing coach and performer in While Darlings Sing the Blues, a ceremony and documentary film on a former Southern slave plantation, and performed in the monologue-based play She, Her, produced by actor Brian Cox for the 2022 Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Out of her commitment to healing collective trauma through arts, ancestral healing, and medical humanities, she's also taught at Columbia, CUNY School of Medicine, and has led writing workshops from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Poetry Foundation, to Rikers Island Correctional Facility. She holds a BA from Cornell, an MFA from Columbia, and sits on the board of narrative medicine at CUNY School of Medicine. Please feel free to find her at www.antoinettecooper.com or on Instagram or Facebook at Antoinette Be Free. It's my pleasure to introduce to you all Antoinette Cooper.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jade, for the introduction. It is my pleasure to be here and to share with you all. And in the spirit of narrative medicine, medical humanities, I also look forward to there being a conversation generated and also feedback and questions and conversation with everyone in attendance. I will start with a poem, and I will share the history of that poem afterwards. And so this poem is published in Intima, and it is titled the metamorphosis or phronesis. Lying in bed, I grow uncomfortable at how bone presses against bone. The pain of kneecaps grinding against one another in child's pose made sleep impossible the night before. I have not stepped on a scale lately, have no energy to take more than a few steps a day, but somehow know that I must have spent weeks wasting away. The only time it felt good to laugh was when I put on a once tight skirt, only to watch it slowly slouch down to my ankles while finding no frame to hold on to. I am no more. And yet I marvel at how the body has become so determined to live, even when the soul starts to dream of that other place. I'm not sure who will greet me on the other side, maybe the mothers. But I know I no longer feel welcome in this pain body. My husband gently lifts me out of bed, taking breaks to let me adjust the pelvic weight of my watermelon-sized tumor so that I can walk to the bathroom. Today is the day I'm scheduled to have surgery. And in honor of the occasion, I thought it best to shower. Everything hurts. Even the warm streams of water on my skin feel like punishment. And when the torture of touch is over, I declare myself ready. There is nothing that could have prepared me for traversing the New York City streets. The city is too bustling with life to welcome someone like me, someone who walks with death. Every pothole is an atom bomb inside of me. Every red light, a personal attack. Every taxi driver in a rush towards life, a slap in the face. I close my eyes and hum old Negro spirituals, hoping that the ancestors hear in the silences that I too am ready to come home. I wanna be ready. I wanna be ready. I wanna be ready. Mm, mm, mm. When I arrive at the hospital, I notice how the pace of life continues to speed past. Doctors speak at my body. My hand signs papers as though she has authority to give away organs if they determine the tumor is cancerous. I am asked every question except how I am doing. I am scared. I am no more. My husband says that when I woke from my drugged sleep, I hummed before I could speak, a low hum that connected me to a time before language, speaking in tongues. And when I spoke to the living, my first words were that I'd been split in half. And when I saw the metal that held my lower half intact with my upper half, I cried out that I was a monster. The metamorphosis or phronesis. When I was writing this prose piece, it went through several iterations. And even the title itself spoke to the iterations. I wasn't sure which title to give it, and that's why it has in parentheses or phronesis. And the person I was working with thought that that was the title. It was supposed to hold two titles. And so I just went with that to let the piece actually hold the tension of not knowing which way to go. And metamorphosis, of course, when we think of the butterfly that started out with caterpillar and how something dies before getting to that next stage. And phronesis was there are many ways to understand that word, but the one that spoke to me was wisdom in ending things. And so that kind of taking agency, and that the wisdom in ending things and the surgery being a part of that, and also my own agency being a part of that, and really practicing, honoring, accepting what I was becoming, and releasing what I was letting go or what had been taken. And this piece almost didn't get shared because I say my husband, and I'm no longer married. And that's also something that shows up in the illness narrative, that when women are the ones that bear illness in their bodies, it impacts their relationships because they do so much in relationship and are the foundation of relationship. And so when they are ill, then the relationships tend to fall apart at a greater rate. And then from that, women who then are diagnosed with a chronic illness, then that has an even greater impact on relationship. And there was a part of me that wanted to X out husband ever, or never let this poem see the light of day. And what I had to be with was that the poem had its own intention and beingness in the world. And wrapped up in the tension of it is also the impact it had with my relationship. And the poem had the right to be and tell that story as well. So it was really surrendering to the will of the poem that had me share it. And the evolution of the poem, in the beginning, I wasn't actually writing at all. And I was in a master's program for creative writing, which was a huge dilemma. And I hated writing. I hated writing, I hated words, I hated looking at words, I hated working with words. And I needed to understand where that was coming from. And I then started participating in an independent study to understand the experience I was going through. And that led to my being in a narrative medicine course. But in the independent study, there was a book that I was introduced to, where in it said pain destroys language. That when we get to a certain level of pain, we become pre-verbal. And that's what was happening with me and language, that the amount of pain that I was experiencing in my body had actually reclaimed language. And part of my healing process was a reclamation, both of language and a reclamation of body simultaneously. And in the reclamation of language, I was still distancing. And so in the beginning for this prose piece, I didn't write it as I wrote it in third person. She, lying in bed, she grows uncomfortable at how bone presses against bone. And I found it really interesting that in order to tell my story, I needed to have the distance and to write about something that happened to someone rather than to me. And the piece stayed that way, I don't know for how long, until the advisor that I was working with said, Antoinette, I think it's time that you go back to that piece. Now that I've learned how to navigate the lands of my body and to navigate illness and to stay in my power as I navigated and to navigate my agency in the doctor's office as I had graduated through that process and had passed through that initiation. Now it's time to return to the piece and change it from third person to first person, putting myself in it. Whereas I was telling the story of something that happened to this body. And in the going back to the piece and the process, again, another process, going through and changing everywhere that it was third person into first person, and being with that and honoring the process and honoring the growth process and honoring the dying process. And story moves with us in that way until the piece said that it was ready to be shared. So ready to be shared both in intimate and ready to be shared here. So thank you for being a witness And I look forward to the conversation that Jade and I will be having and questions that you all have as we complete today.
Thank you, Antoinette, for that. If anyone has any questions or comments that they would like to speak with Antoinette about, or anything that we've addressed today or over the past 3 days, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat and we will do our best to respond to them. But Antoinette, just to bring up something that you just said, you spoke about having to change your piece from third to first person and honoring the process of, we spoke a lot today about changing narrative and the power in our narrative and the power in our voice, and that changes sometimes what that looks like and what our stories look like and what our healing looks like. So what advice do you have to anyone who is a healthcare provider in any aspect in this space to assist those who are in that process of healing and in changing their narrative to aid them in that journey?
One, really honoring the intelligence, the natural intelligence in our bodies, for the ways in which we do not see what we're experiencing, because it can really overwhelm a system to be with what our bodies are going through, especially when we don't have community or networks to hold that with us. And, a trust has to be earned with someone in medicine. And so I don't know you. I don't know if you will hold this with me. And so the distancing that happens is not from non-compliance. The distancing that happens is an intelligent way of an individual protecting themselves in a world that, especially for Black and Brown bodies, often leaves them uncovered. And so someone in the field not going immediately to non-compliance, because during my healing process, I technically was a non-compliant patient, because as I was feeling for who can I trust here, the doctor that would have then been the place that I go to for regular check-ins made it very clear I couldn't trust her. She questioned my own narrative as though she was in this body. She didn't see me at my worst pain point. And I hold pain in such a way that people can't tell unless I self-disclose. And I often, in my own manuscript, compare illness in the Black female body with guinea pigs, and guinea pigs being a prey animal. And as a prey animal, the way that we survive is to not show that we're in pain. And the guinea pig comparison didn't actually come from anything genius within myself. It was me trying to find community around the endometriosis pain that I was dealing with, and Googling other women that have had this experience, and found myself on a forum where women were sharing their narratives about their pain and how they weren't believed. And I was like, wow, this is amazing, this community. And then I actually looked at the URL and saw that it was a forum for the care of pet guinea pigs. It wasn't even, but somewhere in that, on that website, in that forum, there was one channel where women were posting on a forum for pet guinea pigs. And so how the larger question to ask for anyone in medicine is, how are you creating sanctuary such that the people that sit before you feel welcome to share themselves fully in that way? The onus is on you on creating sanctuary.
Very true. And I think it's so interesting that you brought up the point of guinea pigs as a form of prey, because I feel like that metaphor can work in the same vein when we talk about Black women and medical experimentation throughout history. And even, the experimentation on Black women's bodies and gynecology and obstetrics and how that started. So That's also very interesting for you to say. Nicole, I see your question. I think we just answered it. What advice do you have for clinicians to engage in empathetic conversation with those who are suffering? I don't know if you have anything else to add, Antoinette, but I feel like kind of just touched on that.
Well, the one thing that shows up is oftentimes clinicians want to do that with patients, like that's where they try things out, which is then having the patient be the guinea pig.
Right.
So like, do you have the capacity for empathetic conversation outside of being in the presence of someone who is deeply vulnerable? Where do you practice that?
Right.
Are we getting your best? Or are we the place where you try things out? Where do you go to practice the training wheels of empathic conversation? Like that's what I think of the narrative medicine programs as creating, and that we do that with art and not with bodies that are vulnerable. So where do you practice that? And then once you've practiced that, then that question no longer needs to exist.
I see your comment about creating a sanctuary is very popular in the chat right now, and that kind of can lead me into our next question. I know that you're very involved in the liberation of the Black body and abolition and the creation of sanctuary and reimagining what this system that is supposed to care for us but really is failing, what it looks like. So what does that look like to you? What does the abolition and the liberation of the Black body and the creation of true sanctuary in these spaces look like? What does that action look like for you and in your work?
Whatever I do, it's given by a question. And so at the foundation of my projects is a question.
Right.
Specifically, the question that I ask often is, how do I create sanctuary for the Black body? I go in with that question. I'm always assessing, how close am I? I don't go in with an answer. And that enables me to listen for the answer. And really honor what shows up. So something that showed up in my asking that question that I wasn't actually prepared for. How do I create sanctuary for the Black body? The response was, I cannot create sanctuary with a white person who is unconscious of their whiteness. And I didn't go in thinking that, like, there are, people that are educated in all of these fields, people whose hearts are in the best place whatsoever. And with the unconsciousness, something can rise up in that unconsciousness that creates harm. And then when we speak about race, then distancing happens. And so someone may go into defensive mode. Oh, no, that would never happen to me. So taking it beyond race, I cannot create sanctuary for people dealing with trauma with someone who is unconscious about trauma. If you are unconscious about trauma, then you could be unconsciously creating harm. One must have some kind of training in that area. And so we don't have training in racial literacy. So developing oneself in racial literacy then enables people to have more consciousness in it so that they know when they are creating harm. We will create harm. Sanctuary spaces, harm happens. It's just that it is not overridden. It is not stepped over. It must continually, like a home or like your teeth, you must continually be cleaning it.
Well, it's not that it doesn't happen. It's addressed, it's acknowledged, and it's resolved.
Yes. And we can't do that if we are in defensiveness.
Right.
Or if we need to have been perfect. We must acknowledge when we do not create sanctuary or we haven't honored sanctuary. Sanctuary is acknowledging when something has shown up that needs to be addressed.
Very true.
And sanctuary also doesn't mean that it will be a kumbaya space. When you're creating sanctuary for oppressed people, historically oppressed people, then it means that you are sanctuary such that that can rise up in them and be cleared.
Absolutely. We have another question. Would you have an example of an instance of a medical visit where you felt respected and felt you could trust the professional that was working with you? What did that look like? Or what would that look like if you personally feel like you haven't experienced that?
It's not a good sign that I'm thinking at that level.
That's why I added that last part in. What would that look like to you if that's not something you feel you've experienced thus far in your journey?
The places where I've experienced that hasn't been with the doctors.
Right.
And of course, my experience is different now because I work alongside doctors,
Right.
and that's different. But me as the vulnerable body in need of care, I've experienced that with the nurses. I've
Okay.
experienced that with the receptionists. That's something that I speak about in my TEDx talk, that I was in immense pain and was checking out after my appointment, and the nurse saw that I couldn't stand still. I kept switching from foot to foot to really pass the pain from one side to the other. And she asked if I had a prescription for pain meds. I said, no, no one gave me pain meds. And so in that way, someone that is deeply listening to me, deeply looking at me, that's where I've experienced sanctuary before. But structurally, when it comes to appointments, it's a get in, get out. And so that doesn't really serve building sanctuary.
Right. So at this symposium, we didn't define race, and nor did we define racism, but we all know that we currently live in a system of inequality. And as Mike Keogh observed in his panel talk and spoke so eloquently about yesterday for those who were with us. And it's important to pay attention to what isn't said in the silence. Is just as important as what's said in the story. So how did this aspect of, how did racism and this aspect of the silencing and invisibility that we kind of touched on earlier today in our talk, how did that impact your health literacy, would you say?
The silencing, well, like my health literacy as a patient going through it, or my health literacy as someone who is now in the space of creating work in the field?
I guess both. I guess we can start with, because I think your experience as a vulnerable body, and your experience with your illness kind of also informed your work a lot now.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So maybe we could start with
the
patient.
I only got into this work as payback. I was like, these people gonna learn from me. They're gonna learn from me. And so, when I had surgery in 2017, before I went in for surgery, I didn't actually tell anyone. There was my now ex-husband. And there was just this expectation that I was swearing him to secrecy. And he couldn't hold all of that. And he was just like, I have to tell your brother, like, I can't just not talk about this. I was like, fine. I'll talk to my brother. And I made a list of who would be pissed at me if I had surgery and never told them. And so I called those people. And I went in just with this shame around what was happening with my body. I was born in Jamaica. Jamaicans are known to be really powerful human beings. We dominate in the Olympics. A large part of that has to do with the impact of slavery and how we were bred to be really strong bodies, to work in these fields that lifespan was very at a minimum. And so I also identified with like, no, I'm a Jamaican. Like, I just have muscles without even going to the gym. And I was ashamed that my body had illness. And as I started to have the process of getting my voice back, and I started to study illness and narrative and how we tell our stories, and that like I had this relationship with words and that it was fragmented and that I needed to reclaim it and recreate it. As I started to do that work, then I started to see that what happened to me was not just me. I kept blaming myself that I did something wrong. I was carrying the whole weight of that. And then I became really pissed. And I started to see that no, I had been going to the doctor for decades. I had actually been advocating for myself and it kept being dismissed. I started to see where I was practicing agency. And the shift for me happened with, I kept interrogating myself and putting myself down and that I did something wrong. And that's what happens when you come from traumatized conditions. It's all on me, I am responsible. And that's part of the narrative in the world anyways. The violence that happens in Black communities, like we did it to ourselves. No, it's a natural consequence of all of the traumas that we have endured over the centuries. And so I was blaming myself, and I started to switch from interrogating myself to looking at the systems that I was in. And when I did that, then I saw that there was a shared responsibility. And I started to see all of the times that I wasn't being listened to, all of the times that I needed care, all of the times that I said I was in pain and no one was willing to give me pain meds. So that was an important part of this transformation that was happening for me. Really going from interrogating myself to interrogating the systems that I was in and being held in.
We have another question from Nancy in the chat. She says, thank you so much for sharing your experience. Creating Sanctuary resonated with me, and I'm wondering if this is a good way to invite minorities to help me adjust my behavior and language. And then she puts in quotes, I want you to know that I'm working to understand my privilege, and I hope that you will let me know if I do or say anything that hurts you or makes you feel uncomfortable.
As in saying that in the
Right.
in the space with a patient?
Yes.
It's beautiful in that it shows effort. And the question that shows up for me is
or any situation they just added.
Yeah. The question that shows up is interrogating I'm working to understand my privilege. How? Or is it that the people that you're interacting with, they are responsible for educating you? So I see that there's an openness there, right, to learning, and who is being responsible for the teaching. And that, like, if a patient is coming and is dealing with whatever health issues they're dealing with, and on top of that has to educate the person teaching them or educate the person working with them, then that's an extra burden that is being carried by the patient. So that kind of statement works if the caregiver is doing work and has someone that is helping them to support them in that work, but not necessarily asking the patient to do that work for them. Does that make sense?
All right, let us know if you guys have any other questions on that topic. Oh, they said totally. All right, so I know in Black Exhale, you just spoke a lot. Oh, Nancy has a follow-up question. So she says, so how do we avoid that? And how will the patient know?
Take it beyond race, because somehow when it comes to race, like something gets in the way of the ways in which we process. Take it beyond race for a moment. Trauma. And if you're working with trauma specifically, then What training have you done to understand the language of trauma, the different ways in which it shows up? How can you create an environment where your development is not what's being centered, but the patient themselves? And do you have enough resourcing to be that present for a patient? And if not, then how can you develop the resourcing? And so that kind of question too also points to that perhaps that resourcing isn't there. So really being with your own discomfort, getting that discomfort is pointing to, wait a second, I need more resourcing, and not being one who is usurping what little resourcing the patients have. I used to teach at Rikers, and part of my time teaching there was when I was going through divorce. And the semester where I was going through divorce, I didn't teach. And a part of it was I recognized I didn't have resourcing to be fully present for these women. And I'm a firm believer of, when you go into these spaces, you do not go into those spaces hungry and expect them to feed you. And so what do I need to do to be full to do that work? That's how you are a resource in the space. But if you go hungry and you expect your patients to feed you, and you have access and privilege and training and resourcing, then tap into that. Yeah, it will be extra work, and you got this.
Thank you, Antoinette. I know, you just said something about the burden that patients come into these spaces with, especially as people of color, especially as Black men and women. And in Black Exhale, I know from work we've done together previously, you do a lot of work surrounding addressing collective trauma and the ways that collective trauma presents itself. So what are some of the different ways that you've seen collective trauma present itself in the Black body and the Black community? And in the healthcare system, as a whole?
Yeah. Just in general, the way we look at care is very individualistic. Just in general, the American cultural systems are very individualistic. Success is very individualistic. Individualism just runs rampant. And the wounding happened at the level of the collective. It wasn't one African that was brought here. It was a collective. Folks were chained together. Folks were in slave ships together. And then in our attempts to just put people into communities so that we don't have to look at them, that's a collective gathering of people and then resources taken from them. And so a collective wound happens. And so we need to begin to start to ask the questions of, if the wounding happened at the level of collective, then how can we also create healing at the level of collective? And those questions aren't asked. And yes, individual healing is necessary. Go to your therapist's office, sit one-on-one. That level of attention is beautiful and necessary. And there is also a collective wound. How that looks is, there's my relationship with myself, and being a traumatized body means really not liking myself and having to work on that. And there's also a space in between even us, Jade, and that space in between us has energy as well, that relational field. And so how can I heal the space between us? If that space isn't healed between us, then immediately when I see you, I want to compete with you. I don't like you. I don't like anything about you. I want to attack you. But it doesn't mean that something is wrong with you or something is wrong with me. It doesn't mean there's a comment that can be made on our moral character. it really points to the relational field between Black folk also carries a wound. And each time we've attempted to heal that relational field historically, it has been interrupted. There were the slave codes that criminalized Black people being in relationship with one another, where two or more are gathered. Biblically, it is said that that is where power lies, where two or more are gathered. And it was for that reason that the gathering of Black folk was a problem. Where two or more are gathered, that there is power there, would undermine the institution of slavery. When there are acts against sanctuary spaces like churches, that interrupts the relational space between Black folk. When children are torn away from their mothers, or fathers are made to breed with people and never really raise children, that impacts the relational field between Black folk. And that has happened for centuries upon centuries upon centuries upon centuries. When did that get healed? And then we want to criticize how mothers treat their children, how fathers leave their children, how marriages disintegrate. No, that is all a symptom of something that has never been healed. And we need to create those containers, because folks that are in the wound may not have the resourcing for it. Except in creating those containers to do that healing, do we then have an environment that would support the relational field between us being healed? Because the more I love myself and the more I love my sister and the more I love my brother, then the more this capitalistic system that depends on our broken bodies can no longer exist. And so we really have to grapple with and tell the truth about that we are living in systems that have never honored us tapping into our collective power. And it's not to say, let us be powerless in my saying that. Like, one must first acknowledge it. It's the same with illness. We must first diagnose before we can get to what it is that must be done for healing to occur. And it is, and as anyone knows, if you just give a drug, but you don't actually acknowledge what continues to bring about the inflammation, then you have to then use methods that in and of itself are traumatic. So the collective body, I often think of the individual Black body, and I also think of the collective Black body. Let us diagnose that as well. And let us look at what are the conditions that supports a healthy collective Black body. And then from there, what are the conditions that supports a healthy collective human body? But getting to the level of the collective with the human body doesn't mean that a gathering of Black folk is a threat to us tapping into our full humanity. If my arm has gangrene and I'm just like, no, the whole body must be restored. No, we put attention where the wound is. Or sometimes where the pain is not the same as where the wound is either. So the body is my source of wisdom in all of this. So when we judge Black folk and the violence that they have towards one another, we're not actually looking at it from the source and the depth of that source. And it could be that we might feel powerless around, we don't really know how to deal with that. Be with that then. Don't act like it's not there. Let's sit with, I want to see it, but there's a part of me that feels overwhelmed by it.
I think we have another question circling back to the point of privilege in the clinical setting that you addressed earlier. Wanda says, how do we help her understand her privilege? I guess the person who wants to acknowledge that they're trying to address their privilege within the clinical space? Should this be done by someone that does not have privilege or someone that already understands their privilege?
I'll answer that question with another analogy. Because oftentimes when we think of race and racial literacy, we make the assumption that somehow we should naturally develop an intelligence in that. No, that needs to be a concentrated area of study. So that's the equivalent of someone explaining something in the field of quantum physics, and I have no understanding about it whatsoever. How do I help them see what there is to know about this quantum physics theory? One must study it. Same thing with racial literacy. One must study it. Just because I am human doesn't mean that I have access to the knowledge of quantum physics. Even just because I'm Black doesn't mean that I have deep racial literacy either. I might bear the wound of the impact of a racialized, violently racialized society, but I might not have language for it. And so the people that are out in the street protesting, they may not have language, but they know the wound. And because I have language, then I can sit here and put it into a creative piece of work. And that's how I support. I may not go protest, but I've developed myself enough to have language. And I've had to study racial literacy myself, even as a wounded somebody. And actually in studying it, that's part of how I've developed my agency. So when I ended up back in the hospital, after I made a promise that no doctor would touch me again, when I ended up back in the emergency room, because I had been developing my literacy around racialized care, around chronic illness, then when it happened, I was like, got it. Like, I see what chronic illness means, got it. So I developed my literacy around it in order for me to have more agency. When something happens, especially as I'm doing this work, I interact with people and they say things and they don't know how in the world they said that. And I can be with grace around what has come out of their mouth or their actions, but because I've been developing myself in literacy, then I could also point to, this is privilege showing up, or these systems have supported you in this way, or the way that person was looking at me, or the way that person was addressing you as though this was your project instead of me because I'm the Black person. My development of literacy helps me to stay present in those circumstances and to do some education work if I so choose.
We have another, can you talk/share a little bit more about abolition medicine? This came up in Dr. Dasgupta's talk as well.
For me, abolitionism, when I was in Scotland for the Fringe, part of my bio was that I was an abolitionist, and there was a theater review of the piece that I was in, and in the theater review, he put abolition in quotes. It said abolitionist, which was anti-Black, and he didn't see it. And I remember seeing a documentary that said any African that had chains on them was an abolitionist. That's all it takes to become an abolitionist. And so how can we get free? And I bring that to everything. And I interrogate all systems. And so abolitionist medicine too is about interrogating all of those systems. Gynecology, the importance of gynecology developed in order to keep Black women procreating so that the fields had enough manpower, woman power, Black people power. It wasn't about the care of us. We were the first guinea pigs. I can't say first like worldwide, but I'm very clear that my focus is on the Black body. So I bring that bias and that intention, and that's where I am. So first, in terms of this, this system that we now live in, that we were the first for that, to build up this machine. And if we really want to undo that, then we have to be able to have the courage to look at how it still is functioning in ways in which it was designed. There is a distinction between abolitionism, or the abolition of a thing, and a thing ending. So slavery was not abolished. It's just the way in which it looked ended, and it transformed. It had its own metamorphosis. And we are dealing with what we are dealing with in medicine because we actually haven't gotten to abolitionism. And what gets in the way of abolitionism is we can only have these conversations in really dualistic ways of good, bad. And in those ways, then people can't be with the violence that has been done. And that gets in the way of us actually transforming it. Abolitionism acknowledges that something must die. Right now, what is dying are marginalized people. What must die are the systems. And what we are most attached to are the systems. And what we are instead used to is Black death.
So it doesn't feel like a crisis anymore, because it just comes with the territory. It's the foundation that the system was built upon, and it just comes with it, right?
Yeah, and we have all of these reasons to prove it.
Yeah.
We eat this way, we do this to one another. Those are all symptoms. The ways in which we, the way in which we deal with the individual body, we also are dealing with the collective body in the same way. We get so distracted by the symptoms that we don't pay attention to the source.
Wanda says, how do we educate providers and get them to see that we are people that feel pain, that we are human? That's the big question.
Oh man, I have such a problem with that. Just because there's so much labor. There's so much labor. Oh, Wanda, my heart goes out to you. That's so much labor.
We're circling back to that burden.
Yeah. Yeah, I left law school. I'm a law school dropout. And I remember when someone from the admissions office came to speak to me to ask about me staying at the law school. I said, she just said like how much I was valued and how much they needed my voice there. And I just said, why can't I be like one of the white kids and just like go to school? I don't want to save everybody. And then look at me with my nonprofit, whatever. But at least it was an assignment from spirit and not from someone in a law school. But I didn't want to save everybody. And then in in college, I was protesting there. And I had community. There was much more developed we space in the college that I was in. And the law school, it would have just been this individual journey of slowly killing myself for JD. And she wasn't getting it. And so I then said, I would rather use your JD to wipe my behind than put up on my wall. She said, okay, got it. So you're leaving. Yes, I am leaving. So I don't think that we should take it upon ourselves to educate providers. I think that we should take it upon ourselves to center ourselves and our healing. Tell your story. And what providers need to do is to develop the capacity to listen. And as they develop that capacity, then your stories will be there to be received. That's what it means to be a witness, to be unobtrusively present. And there is so much healing that needs to happen in the traumatized body that is a lifetime assignment. Your assignment is to connect to your own body, to become embodied again. Part of the consequence of this much trauma is the separating from our bodies. Now, of course, to have harm done means that white-bodied folks also have disembodied. And as they fully embody, or anyone on a certain side of history, as they fully embody, then they can learn to be present for another first, to create that healthy we space, and to take away the person in power, person not in power duality that exists. And we start to see that the patient, the one who comes from a marginalized body, allow them to have power in their own body. Do not interrupt that. And we start to negotiate with that person around their agency with their own bodies. But ego can't be a part of that. It doesn't mean that you can't be respected as a physician. It is a contribution to allow someone from a marginalized community to see that they have agency with their well-being. It's a contribution, not an undermining of what it means to be a physician.
All right, Antoinette, I know we have a few more minutes left and we have some really great questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to read this one that states, how do we address those who have taken a crash course in, as you put, quantum physics, but think that's enough? How do we avoid becoming a token minority in our organizations?
Speak. Speak, 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 speak. Feel into the discomfort that comes with the speaking. For me, I don't speak because I have a natural talent for the discomfort of it. I don't have a natural talent, but I do have an understanding that when I'm silenced and when I suppress things, then that's when illness manifests. And it's in honor of the promise that I made to not be touched again by doctors that I speak. Because every time things are suppressed in me, then that creates another thing. And so is that person worth my silence? No. I also, when I speak, I make it clear why I am speaking. So I am committed to sanctuary, and I don't have the experience of sanctuary in this space. Or this is a we space between us, and something happened, and it must be addressed, and I don't want to override. So the context that you create will call forth your voice. I've also declared in certain spaces that I'm the person that just will always talk about Black stuff. And so part of it is I'm pretty much always ready for people to be like, oh, there she goes again, talking about Black stuff. So I front load that and say I'm the person that will just always talk about Black stuff. And that makes it easier for people to to be with me, because I will talk about Black stuff. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Antoinette. We're going to, if anyone has any further questions for Antoinette or is interested in keeping up with her, please, as we said before, connect with her on Instagram and Facebook at Antoinette Be Free, and her website, www.antoinettecooper.com. This was a profound and powerful conversation, Antoinette. I know we could all sit here all day and listen to you continue to speak about your wonderful work and this wonderful work that we're all taking community and taking part in and holding space together. So we are super, super grateful for this conversation and for this your vulnerability today and your willingness to share your story. And in honor of you, closing out today, speaking up and not becoming the token minority, I just want to go ahead and reiterate, Audre Lorde's quote that we shared today: "Your silence will not save you. My silence did not save me." And in these spaces where minority communities and marginalized populations are so often rendered invisible, I hope we can all encourage one another and those that we work with and care for to speak their truth and live in their freedom as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in the 3-day Racism and Health Literacy Symposium hosted by us here at Say Ah. It has been a pleasure to learn in community with you all and to learn from you all and to hear your thoughts and how you're going to take this information back to your organizations and communities. A special thanks to all the Say Ah board members, all our speakers, Antoinette once again. And please fill out the evaluation. Anna just dropped the link in the chat. Please feel free to share Antoinette's poem with your organizations. We also dropped that link, that PDF in the chat, and feel free to email us with any questions or concerns that you have from today's events and the entire symposium. Thank you once again, everyone.